it really brought home to me the absolute lack of understanding about trauma, how people become targets, what it is that the predators are actually looking for. Trauma is very specific. It's not rocket science, but it's very specific. That leaves us with a really ingrained sense of shame. If we're going to have a boundary, we have to first of all know that we've got a right to have that boundary. Hello everybody, I'm Catriona Morten. I'm a sensory motor psychotherapist. And today I'd like to talk to you about why some people have multiple traumas, things that just keep happening to them time and time again. Before I jump into that, if you're enjoying these videos, please give us a like, subscribe to our channel, because it really helps us get a message out there to loads more of you. I used to come across this a lot when I was a child protection social worker. There would be children come into the system who had multiple violent things happen to them, assaults, rapes, over and over again. They had one thing in common. They all came from a very, very difficult family background. They'd all had severe neglect, abuse, trauma, and these things just kept happening to these children. And unfortunately, the police and the courts were very unsympathetic and could be very blaming of these children because they had absolutely no concept of the damage and the harm that can be done from abusive childhoods, violent family homes, and the subsequent effects of trauma and being a traumatized young person. I spent quite a lot of my time trying to educate and tell people why this was the case and writing reports and arguing about this. And it really brought home to me the absolute lack of understanding about trauma. These children were not just putting themselves in places of danger. They were being groomed, they were being predated upon, and they were easy victims. But it was difficult looking through a logical eye to see why that had happened. Moving on, many of my clients over the years, present day, they've all had multiple things happen to them. And the majority of them have had very difficult childhoods growing up. But the whole essence of the way that trauma works is the real key to understanding this. Trauma tends to do two things. When we've suffered from trauma, if we have PTSD, one way of dealing with that is absolute avoidance. Avoiding anything that is a trigger, anything that reminds us of the trauma. Places that we can't go to, things that we can't do, just that lack of engaging with things. And that's very, very limiting. Or there's the other side of trauma, which is that things tend to repeat themselves. We tend to recreate traumatic episodes in our life. And that, again, doesn't make any sense looking through just a plain logical lens. There's a lot of theories around about why this recreation happens. I'm not particularly subscribed to any of those theories because I think one theory can't explain a whole spectrum of things. But one of the theories is that we subconsciously, unconsciously recreate similar traumatic experiences in the hope of having a different outcome this time. However, they tend to repeat without having a different outcome, just the same things over and over again. And that can be really difficult for people to understand why we can have multiple violent relationships, why similar things keep happening, why some people have multiple rapes or have multiple violent episodes happen to them. And when we look at it through the trauma lens, it starts to make an awful lot more sense and explain itself. When we've had early childhood trauma, we've got only certain responses available to us with trauma, and that's an overwhelming experience that just it's too much to cope with, and we need our survival brain to kick in. Flight, fight, freeze, a fawn response. One of those things will be available to us at the time. If we're young, we haven't got the capacity or the means for a fight or a flight response. So we usually have a freeze response or a fawning response, which means that we will try and placate and, have minimum damage to us, try and have the best outcome that we can by pleasing and doing what's expected of us. And that can be very difficult to understand, but it's a primal response that we have. Now, if we have one of those responses, if we say take a freeze response, then we might not go into complete and utter frozen state, but we'll just be slightly disabled. We won't be able to act. And anybody predatory will pick that up in a nanosecond. That when someone enters our personal space or says something that's a bit offensive or close to the mark, that instead of coming back at them, a traumatized person will more than often just have a bit of a kind of still response, that they're not able to, their brain and their body triggers and they go into that kind of don't do anything, just freeze. Even if they want to, they actually can't. They haven't got the words, or they haven't got any kind of movement or the means to get up and leave. And it makes them very, very vulnerable. When people are predatory, and there's a lot of predatory people out there, they are on the lookout for those kind of things. Something very revealing was shown to me in a conference when I was a social worker at the family centre, and it was someone called Ray Wire, and he did a lot of work with paedophiles, and he had a way of getting them to open up and talk about it on tape. They'd be filmed, and one NASA employee who was in charge of a schools programme explained so perfectly how he targets and grooms particular children. And it was very simple. He would just move around among them. He would tend to pick on the ones that were kind of hanging back, being quiet, maybe looking a little bit isolated. He's not going for the big, the rowdy ones, the popular ones, the ones that are causing a bit of trouble and speaking up an awful lot. And he would just approach those children, go up to them, enter the personal space. If they didn't move back or give him a look, then he knew that that child didn't have boundaries and maybe had either a fawn or a freeze response. And he would just push it and to test the boundaries and then befriend this child that's maybe the outlier in the group. And it was just so simple, and it really, a kind of penny dropped for me about how people become targets, what it is that the predators are actually looking for. And I see it all the time in my clients. I'll notice something that they're doing just in I notice when I say that and they'll really quickly just correct it. And there'll be a part of them that's then laser focused on me. It's like, oh my God, what does she see? That would tell a predator that that person is going to be a kind of pleaser. They want to do the right thing. They're not going to put up any kind of defense against anything. And it makes them a target, unfortunately. The other thing about just generally us as humans is that we love familiarity. First thing we do when we have a baby is get them into a routine. Routine, familiarity, things being consistent are really important to us. Most of us don't really like change, particularly prescriptive change, and often we don't like unexpected things happening, even surprise parties being thrown for us often, because it's unexpected. It's not what we're prepared for. And that sense of familiarity, and if we've grown up in a violent household, we know how to operate in that kind of environment. It's familiar to us. It doesn't mean we like it. And it doesn't mean that people that consistently get into violent relationships that they like it. There's something very familiar about it. They know how to operate, they know the rules of engagement, and in some ways, that familiarity is a safety. When things are really different, often people feel completely out of their comfort zone and don't know the rules of engagement, don't know how to be in those situations. Because when we've been used to dealing with either predators or violence or really unexpected things happening, then we get very good at second guessing what's coming up. We get really hypervigilant. We lose all sense of ourself and just be really tuned into what might be coming at us next, or what we might do that would mitigate something kicking off, or what might please the other person so it doesn't kick off. Those behaviours become really ingrained. They're really unconscious. They're just part of our learned behaviours, our procedural thinking. And when those things have been formed through attachment in the young, they're just hardwired into us. And so, again, it makes those people very easy targets and very easy to get into those relationships because they haven't got the boundaries, they haven't got the kind of sense of themselves. And that brings me to another really important part of this. If we've experienced a lot of neglect, violence, trauma, abuse growing up, that leaves us with a really ingrained sense of shame. This cloak of shame, not wanting to show up. It becomes really difficult to have any sense of self-worth and a right to have things. A lot of my clients believe that deep down they're not very good people. If I really knew what they were like, I wouldn't want to see them anymore, which is never, ever the case. That those little wounded child parts of us, they really believe that because it's the only sense that they can make of this chaos and this violence that's been around for them. If we're going to have a boundary, we have to first of all know that we've got a right to have that boundary, that we're worth having a boundary for, as well as not having a freeze response or just really constricting ourselves when anything feels uncomfortable or slightly, something we have to be wary of. That makes it really hard to have a boundary. We might know up here what we want to do, but the actual physical nature of doing that, having that, enacting that, is really, really hard. And unless we're able to process the original trauma so it doesn't trigger all of those things, then that freeze, flight, if we've got one, fight response, fawn response, is going to be the first thing that kicks in. It's survival, and so we can't just override it. But when we process the trauma through EMDR or through body work, then it disengages us from that procedural, really fast survival thing that happens to us. And then we can begin to work in a very slow way, a very safe, slow way, so that we can see exactly what's happening to the body, where it moves to, what it does, what it can't do, what it can do. And when we can have, little slithers of things that resemble the trauma, just, bringing those elements into the therapy in a very small, safe way, it enables us to have a different experience, to be able to either complete something that we weren't able to complete, or to move when previously we were unable to move and frozen. And finding ways of regulating and working with those trauma responses can really help us move out of this kind of locked place that trauma keeps us, because we can't just override it. We might think, why didn't I, ask a rape victim? Why didn't you fight back? Those people, they're immobilized, they're overwhelmed, they're overpowered, they're probably frozen and absolutely unable to make a sound or to have any kind of action whatsoever. And when we understand it through the lens of trauma, of how trauma affects our brain and our body, then it makes things a lot easier and a lot clearer. And that's why it's so important. So I'm doing all these videos to try and get that message out there. Trauma is very specific. It's not rocket science, but it's very specific. If we just look at things logically, why did all these children put themselves into such risky positions? Why are they part of these really violent gangs? Why do they have all these relationships? And like I say, courts, they don't understand it. And they look at the victim, it's like 5 traumatic events? Really? Well, what part are you playing in that? Without really taking into consideration the impact and the effect that trauma has upon us. If we have any chance of having a boundary, then we've got to be able to do this work from the inside out first. If we just go, oh gosh, I have no boundaries, I'm going to go to a boundary class and learn to set a boundary. You know, there's my boundary. No. And if we can't work on what might disable that boundary and what makes it so difficult to have in the first place, then it doesn't matter how much we do, we're going to be disabled. We're not going to be able to maintain that if somebody pushes against it. And that just repeats the cycle of, oh, I'm hopeless, I can't do anything for myself, I'm a terrible person, I failed again. We've got to do it the right way around. And so when we can understand the nature of the trauma, see how it's affected the body, process it, work with it, and then do the pieces of work afterwards, then we're able to have all of those things in place. So I hope that helps make some sense. If there's anybody that you know that's had multiple things happen to them, then it might just help you understand a little bit more, have a bit more empathy, and just have some awareness of this very hidden world of trauma that exists out there for an awful lot of people. So again, if you've enjoyed this video, then please give us a like, subscribe to our channel, because it really helps us. And I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye!